Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money, I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. Hey everyone, for today's episode I was able to get back onto the pod Dr. Dale Pappas. This episode's going to serve as a kind of way to help listeners who listen especially to the historical segment to kind of get back into the groove of things as we enter a transitionary period in the Greek Civil War. Also, and more importantly, I need more time to read and write for the next couple episodes. So, what is today's episode about anyways? Well, that would be the concept of the European Civil War in the 20th century, which again, it's a concept that dozens of conflicts that took place in the 20th century, from Spain to Russia to Finland to the Greek Civil War, were not just isolated conflicts on an island, but more interlinked and in touch with each other than we previously thought. We talked about Civil War in general, as in what makes one and what they are and are not, guerrilla warfare a bit, the role of ideology and how these play into these conflicts and whatnot, and a lot of other stuff as well. I want to give a really big shout out as well to you, the listeners, and the Patreons. People like Rongta Wu, Expat Frank, Megas Yorgos, and Darth Mater. Your support means more than you know. It really helps keep this project up and running. If it wasn't for you, I don't want to say I would have stopped already. I think committed myself to at least finish this segment, and I want to follow through on that. But your financial support makes such a big difference. It goes directly to paying bills and other things that keep this project running. And with that being said, now on to the show.
Well, I was just gonna say it gives the listeners something to also maybe like if they want to look into how Greece fits into other historical events, other civil wars, and those kinds of conflicts, social problems. Kind of gives people a chance to look at that.
Yeah, especially given the let me introduce everyone. Hey everyone, it's Tom. I got Dr. Dale Pappas here again. We're having a discussion today on a couple of things, kind of overview of what does the Greek Civil War in the context of 20th century European Civil War, if you want to look at that, at that concept of what that is and what that means. We're going to drill down a couple of things. This episode's a little more loose and fast, if that's the word, kind of firing from the hip a bit last second. But I really appreciated Dr. Pappas for making the time. Huge help and a good friend of the pod. So, it's actually Dr. Pappas kind of prompted me to have this episode because he thought, like he was just saying, it would be really beneficial for you guys. And, with all the talk, unfortunately, of Civil War in the States, it's like, where we are. Um, yeah, I mean, and then we can drill down into how it pertains to how it relates to the historical segment I'm running on the Greek Civil War and yada yada yada. Um, so I found this one part. I mean, do you want to talk about what Civil War actually means and just kind of go from there and whatnot? I mean, I can talk to you about what I found from what I pulled just from Stati Kalivas's book, The Logic of Violence in Civil War. It's kind of like well known ish. Does a case study of the Greek Civil War and the Spanish Civil War and a couple other places.
Mm.
You want me to go ahead and read this, Dr. Pappas?
Mm.
Okay. So this is what I pulled, and I thought it'd be really good for you guys. Quote, Civil War offers irresistible opportunities to those who are not naturally bloodthirsty and abhor direct involvement in violence. The manipulation of political organizations by local actors wishing to harm their rivals signals a process of privatization of political violence, rather than the more commonly thought politicization of political life. And then he kind of goes on that he argues to denunciate, quote, I argue that denunciation constitutes a key micro-foundation of intimate violence and hence civil war. And we'll leave that there. It goes on for a little bit. But I mean, I think there are two big components there, kind of the intimacy of the violence of civil war. Think compared to think of World War I where you have trenches on two opposing men with the no man's land in between. The Civil War that we're about to really get into in our timeline on this historical segment, mid to late 1943, it's going to be very intimate, and we've already seen a lot of intimate stuff in our historical segment. Is there anything you wanted to add on that, or?
I think that's a great intro to civil wars in general and what makes a civil war. And that I think also really illustrates, and your intro to this has really shown how scholars, of course, debate what a civil war means, like historians and scholars of different kinds of conflicts will have their criteria and whether or not certain things actually meet this criteria. But what you pointed out there is something that pretty much anyone would agree on, this sort of context of a civil war being very intimate in terms of the violence that's perpetrated there, and also what motivates people to actually participate in a conflict like this. So that does get at what is sort of the key feature, I think, of almost any conflict that we would label as civil war, is that sort of violence. And honestly, even conflicts that are not known to history as civil wars are often being now looked at in that way by applying those sorts of ideas. So trying to see, say, like the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War in
I was
America.
just going to say, I think that's a great example that's often overlooked.
It's become a lot more common in the scholarship these days, and it's actually even been basically the premise of the latest Ken Burns documentary. It's one of his main arguments in that series, is that the war was actually a civil war on many different levels. So that is something that is coming out very clearly in the scholarship, but really only in like the last 10 to 15 years in that way. So it goes to show that whether we call a conflict a civil war or other conflicts have sort of features that resemble that sort of conflict, we often drill down on that idea of it's a very sort of intimate, often ritualistic violence, like symbolic violence as well. So not just the sort of violence that we would see in a conventional war, right? With two sides, different countries, they're going to fight it out because they have some sort of dispute that they can't resolve diplomatically as they feel at that point, but that the war will end eventually and there will be a peace made, right? We don't necessarily see that kind of violence in those conflicts. It's not that they're not violent, not that people aren't killed or wounded and face different kinds of challenges in those conflicts, but it is different.
Yeah, I see. I mean, and there's another part where Stathis Kalivas talks about where, quote, while political actors use civilians to collect information and win the war, it is also the case that civilians use political actors to settle their own private conflicts. And, I chuckle because it's, I don't know if ironic's the word, but it's something I feel would be overlooked. by stating something as a civil war, I think it provides agency to a lot of the people. And then by not saying it's a civil war and going the flip side, perhaps you give too much agency more to international actors and less to the people on the ground. But to that quote that I mentioned, yeah, I mean, it's a means to an end, a ways to the, however you say, I'm talking about, a path to the goal of perhaps acquiring more land from your neighbor that you hate because reason A, B, C, or an old family feud with another family across the street. And it has, again, that intimacy of the violence and the intimacy of the disputes and whatnot. Um, yeah.
And that really brings up the idea too about whether or not we're really talking about ideology here or not, right?
Ah,
And
it's a great segue.
to what extent a conflict is ideologically motivated, and do civil wars, for instance, need to sort of have these very clear cut camps, rival camps fighting each other, ideologically committed to opposing viewpoints, and one side is going to win out over the other.
Do you want to talk? Let's move forward since you brought that up. I think that's a great way to move forward into the concept, as you call it, and many other historians have referred to it as the European Civil War. Which, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'll give you the dumb ape explanation, and you let me know where you agree, where you disagree, and give me a grade or whatnot. Right? European Civil War, as I understood it, just from trying to drill it down, it's essentially a conglomeration of conflicts. And we're talking about the 20th century. We can start as early as the Russian Revolution. We can go on to the Russian Civil War, which, just like we had talked about earlier, many revolutions are in themselves also civil wars, right? And, so between the whites, the reds, anarchists, like 1917 and 1922 ish. I mean, Finland had a civil war, there's a German Revolution, Hungarian conflicts in Hungary, Spanish Civil War, very famous, right? I mean, the Italians had their own version of a civil war, and then, of course, with the historical segment I'm running on, the Greek Civil War, right? So that's what we refer to as the European Civil War, correct? Generally speaking.
Yeah, I mean the concept has been developed to see those conflicts of the 20th century beginning actually not just with the Russian Revolution, though that's certainly part of it, going all the way back to World War One, or sort of right on the eve of World War One, seeing all of the global wars of this time and all of those conflicts within Europe that are often, as we know, very much connected to the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, seeing all of these things as one interconnected event rather than a bunch of different wars that we would need to follow. And the reason why some scholars believe this to be the case is that they see all of these conflicts basically being boiled down to an ideological conflict
I was just going to
between,
say what connects them
right,
is the ideology of it all,
this is a
of
three-way
the conflicts.
struggle. Right, this is that three-way struggle between, will liberal democracy triumph in Europe? Will fascism triumph in Europe? Is communism going to be the dominant ideology of that day? So all of the, and to an extent, of course, as we can see, most of those conflicts, if they weren't explicitly fought for that reason, as many of them have those sort of elements, that it's a conflict between, say, communists or socialist
Right.
leaning,
Left to right,
right?
center, variations of that.
Exactly. So that is, of course, then one way that you can see why people might look at those conflicts as actually interconnected events.
So, I mean, would you say then ideology, I mean, from what it gathered, ideology does seem to be the primary driver of many of these conflicts. It's
I,
fair to say.
I would say if we broke that down individually, especially in the European context in the 20th century, that ideology does matter a lot. But I'm not someone that falls into that camp that, to go back to that idea of a civil war and what makes a civil war, we're talking about the intimacy of violence and the kind of opportunistic nature of a lot of people fighting in that conflict. I don't really like the idea myself that, and I agree with scholars who say that ideology is certainly something that's going to kind of help us clearly see the dimensions of that conflict. But if we're going to say that ideology has to be the dominant feature of a civil war, is that really the way to see it? I don't think so for that reason.
It's an
That just
oversimplification, you could say.
Yeah, I think that it kind of, in a way, I think it's especially, it sort of misses the mark on the actual reality on the ground from a military situation. That
Mm,
often what ends up happening, this idea of who fights in a civil war, typically, it's kind of what you mentioned with the quote at the beginning, too, was hinting at this of who's actually really participating in a civil war. Are these the people who are the true believers that are all fighting? Is everybody in these armies 100% ready to be a martyr to this cause, and that's why they volunteered to fight in this conflict? And really, what a lot of scholars say is that's not the case. That actually, some scholars use this term, they call it active minorities, which is basically a fancy way of saying the fence sitters, the bystanders, the people switching sides because a certain army was in their neighborhood that month, and they weren't in the
that's a
previous
great
month,
point.
and then all of a sudden they're going to be best friends with the other side, or people of the other side. They're going to help them. So really, who bears the brunt of these conflicts, both sort of experiencing them as well as fighting in them in some form? It's often people who are on those margins. Some scholars also use this term, the gray zone, right, to talk about these people. That this is really where civil wars are fought. And there are so many examples. We don't have to restrict ourselves to the Greek Civil War, to European conflicts of the 20th century. We can see this in so many different Civil War examples of people doing these things, going to the other side because maybe they don't want to spend the rest of the war in a prison camp. So they'll
Right.
volunteer to fight.
Survival, yes.
I mean, even it might surprise people, for instance, too. I know that when I learned this, it was kind of surprising to see how many people, how many soldiers had this or did this in the American Civil War, where we tend to think of the two sides are very clearly delineated here. It's sectional, it's north south. We see the ideological component of that, preservation of the Union, maybe emancipation of slaves versus keeping slavery, maintaining slavery, defending a sort of traditional society in the South. Well, guess what? A lot of Confederate soldiers ended up fighting in Union armies. And in fact, thousands of
Wow.
Confederate soldiers put on blue coats and fought in the Civil War. That's a little odd to us because we're always taught that, oh, all these people were very clearly aligned
Right. And we
with,
use ideology as that driver to come to that assumption, that
right,
conclusion, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the
Wow.
realities are a lot more complicated, and it's only going to get more complicated when we look at those European examples from the 20th century.
Yeah. I mean, we're slowly starting. We've ran into this, and I've covered this in past episodes. But just because someone joins Elas or Edes or he or any of these paramilitary groups that we're going to see come and go. I mean, many of them we're going to see are going to just go kaput or be absorbed by other groups. It doesn't necessarily mean A, B, or C. There are monarchists in Elas for whatever reason other than, hey, I get to shoot Germans, or like you said, this is the dominant. What else am I going to do? What am I going to do? Be the only person in Edes in my village, or the only person in Elas in my village, when the rest of my village is, dominantly monarchist. I have a wife and three daughters. You don't. It's not rocket science. I mean, people will do, self-preservation. But you're right. I totally see what you're saying, and I can see how a lot of people fall into that trap as well of ideology. But if you look at it at the personal level, what you're saying makes absolute sense. I mean, what would you do in a
Right.
similar situation, right?
And I think it's also the fact too that it goes, of course, back to memory as well, how these conflicts are remembered and why people want to remember certain conflicts in that way, right? I mean, you'll probably talk a lot about this when it comes to the Greek Civil War, the legacy of the conflict, how it's been remembered, how that has evolved over time, especially from an official
Right.
standpoint, right? That what happens when, if we acknowledge the fact that ordinary people don't really care about this struggle that's going to claim lots of lives and cost a lot of money and really traumatize the state, how do we explain the fact that they're not so motivated by this cause and not so motivated by ideology, right? I mean, if we admit that, we damage perhaps the official view of the victor's side
Right.
that this is why we fought. I mean,
The
that
show's
question,
over. It could threaten that.
that
Yeah, that's
question,
a great point. In other words, the winning, the victorious state, serves a very specific purpose by pushing, perhaps ideology or a certain narrative.
right? I mean, for say, we'll go back to just briefly to that American Revolution example, right? Why in the U.S. has it traditionally been taught that the War of Independence was not so much of a civil war between both, on the one hand, a bunch of people who all saw themselves as British, so the
Yeah.
transatlantic Civil War idea, plus the actual Civil War between Americans who had different views as to what the future of North America should look like, right? If we don't acknowledge that, what we don't have is a situation of admitting that lots of Americans didn't want to be part of the United States. Lots of people who saw themselves as Americans but also as British did not want to see a new country created. And so it's therefore much easier to sort of vilify them or to
Right.
marginalize that
Create the
royalist
other
perspective.
and whatnot that you can contrast yourself against in your state. And, you're right. We're going to see that so much post Greek Civil War. I mean, the post Greek Civil War state is essentially an anti communist state, to my understanding from what I've read. It's firmly anti communist, firmly anchored in NATO. I mean, it's in the context of within the Cold War as well. But like you're saying, right, that whole narrative clinged, that the whole conflict was primarily ideology and ideology would drove people to do A, B, or C or whatever terrible thing serves a purpose, you
And
could
to
say.
and to that point about the anti-communist state, and especially the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? What does that state do in those different iterations of governments? They're all particularly
Persecutes the
exactly,
communists, any remnants left over of
exactly,
them.
exactly,
Witch
right. So
hunt.
there, exactly. So there is this sort of sense that while the fighting may have actually ended, did the conflict really end? Well, no.
Ooh, good point.
They would say that they always had to be vigilant because there is no reconciliation, right? Reconciliation only came much later.
After the
Official,
junta, to my
right,
understanding.
right. It wasn't really until the late 70s, early 80s that there was ever really an official recognition that okay, let's kind of put all of this behind us and move forward as a really united people. That we can't let this sort of ideological divide. We shouldn't vilify one another, and
Yeah,
that
this
is a
conflict happened again.
exactly, and that is a great way to look, or a great example of another really key feature of what makes a civil war, according to a lot of these scholars, like people we're talking about here, is that we were talking about the intimacy, that the sort of how close this violence is to people, how the ideological part of that, while it can be a driving force, is also not that complete explanation. Another side of what makes a civil war, and we're kind of talking around it here right now, but it might be worth bringing in at this point, is what peace looks like in a civil war. And what a lot of scholars say is that, just like we were saying, how conventional wars are often pretty different in the way that they're fought, same thing is true for how peace is made. That if a war has these different, if a civil war, for instance, has these different camps where either side looks at the other as basically illegitimate or as a criminal, essentially. Therefore, it's not really a just war, a conventional conflict. And so there really can't be a just peace. You don't really make peace with your
Oh, I see what you're
enemy.
saying now. Yes,
And
yes,
so
yes.
the Greek Civil War is an excellent example of that idea that the war doesn't end with some sort of peace. There isn't this agreement
Right.
with one another that, oh, we're going to kind of put this
Because it's an
behind us.
ideology. It's a
Exactly.
vague,
It's
intangible, right?
and we can
Like
look at
air.
exactly. And we can look at different examples in history of how these civil wars end or how they could have ended, right? And so let's take maybe the example of another one from outside of this European Civil War frame, but the American Civil War, for instance, and the Greek Civil War is an interesting comparison because what happens at the end of the American Civil War, as the war is ending, right, is that there's this question of, well, okay, if the Union is going to survive, the Union is going to win this war, how do they reinstate? How do they bring back those states that seceded from the Union? How do we do Reconstruction? And so, of course, there were a lot of people, even in Lincoln's own party, especially in Congress, who wanted to go for the really harsh route. Radical Reconstruction was going to be really brutal. It was going to involve trying and executing Confederate leaders and going really harsh on Reconstruction. That this was going to be basically a full-on hostile military invasion and takeover to bring back those Confederate states into the Union. We know that that's not what happened. Reconstruction took a different route, and in part because Lincoln wanted it to go that way as well, but it especially went in that softer direction under Johnson. And we know that none of those things happened in terms of the most extreme punishments that would be dealt to people. That's not what happens in the Greek Civil War case, and in a lot of other instances of 20th century conflicts, we see a very harsh peace dealt out to people. I mean, and we're talking about that right now in terms of the Greek state and the way that they responded in the post-war, post-Civil War years, right? I mean, they did execute some high-profile communist leaders that
Mm.
fell into government hands. So this did happen. And it happened, of course, in many other cases as well. I mean, once the Spanish Civil War ends, for instance, it's not like the Franco regime just doesn't kill their opponents or people suspected of being opponents. They're executing thousands of people after the Civil War ends. So generally, these conflicts do not end with a just peace or I mean, some scholars too have pointed out in terms of this just peace idea or not having that unconditional surrender is what happens, right? Essentially. And unconditional surrender can even take the different forms, like in the American Civil War, unconditional surrender is what happens to the Confederacy.
Right.
But again, like we were mentioning, the leaders are not tried and executed or thrown in jail for the rest of their lives or for a really long time. Unconditional surrender is how World War II ends as
Right.
well. We know that that's a different story for the Axis leaders, even many of those Axis leaders who didn't try to go into hiding or anything, but who signed these agreements. I mean, Keitel, the German leader, he was that signed, one of the German leaders that signed unconditional surrender to the Allies in 1945. He was tried and executed at Nuremberg. Right.
Wow.
Same
Even
thing
though he
happened.
signed the unconditional surrender.
Right, that so you can be a kind of diplomatic representative at that point, but also be seen as a war criminal, right? And
Right.
tried for that. And you weren't going to get a pass because people knew, okay, yeah, you did those things, and you have to be held accountable under the law. Same thing happened to say Tojo in Japan at that point too. That that's just because they were signing those agreements, it didn't somehow give them any kind of protection at that point. It wasn't going to protect them from the fact that they had committed those crimes. And so, even though that's not immediately per se like a local civil war type context, same thing applies as to how these peace agreements or how the wars end in
Right.
general.
It's not like unconditional surrender is a panacea to future conflict propping back up. It's not like, and it's almost the way I see it, and I don't know, let me know what you think, if you agree or not, but it's almost like there's a delicate balance between what's pragmatic and what is a politically expedient and able to be passed. For example, Reconstruction in the South, versus, World War II and Reconstruction of Germany, right? Which, I mean, you look at Germany today, okay, Nazism was defeated, but that came at a very great cost, right? I mean, the country was divided in multiple spheres and whatnot for decades, right? A great cost. And the fact is, just not many people or nations are willing to put that much capital, financial, political, whatever kind of capital you call it, into an enterprise like that. Like very few in history. I mean, I don't know.
Political will,
Right.
at minimum, right? And that is true. I mean, a lot of course, what ends the Reconstruction era in the U.S., for instance, is a question of political will. Had there
Good
been
point.
more political will and more political power, say among Republicans in the South in the 1870s, 1880s, we might have a very different story
Yeah, in a
as to
very
the
different
history.
country today as well,
Right,
perhaps.
right. That it's a very different question, very different set of questions that we'd be asking ourselves. And that's then true. I mean, that always becomes then the point of all these different civil wars. Like anything in history, right? They could have gone different ways, and we're left with those what ifs and sort of counter histories that come up, like what would happen. And the Greek Civil War is also one of those cases where there are a lot of open questions that arise when you think about what might have happened if things were different. And that actually makes me think of the other point that a lot of scholars bring up with civil wars, which is um, foreign intervention.
So, I mean, let's let's talk a bit. Let's drill down a bit more into where Greece fits into this story of the European. Well, actually, no. What? Let me ask you this, because we're on the topic of reconstruction, reconciliation. Am I wrong to think that? How can I say this? Am I wrong to think that if there was more proper reconciliation done, and for the listeners, I bring this up because you've seen this, Dale, and we've talked about this before, where depending what village you go to, there will be memorials. For example, my mother's village where I'm from, where a lot of my family was tortured and executed and just dumped in a mass grave. I mean, we're talking many people from my mother's side by communist andartes. That's what drove me to make this historical segment. I'm still trying to find. Actually, I'm supposed to call some guy that knew my parents. I've heard stories. From the only thing I've heard is that they were beheaded, and I've heard mixed stories. People don't know these things. How would you? Their beards were lit on fire first. Then I've heard conflicting things like, no, they were forced to swallow their beards because my great grandfather was a priest and his son was a priest. And then my grandmother's other brother was a teacher in the village. And this is outside Nemea in Peloponneso. So, the brutality of this conflict and all conflicts, it's really bad. So, anyways, in my mom's village, there is a monument to communist aggression. In my dad's village, there's a monument, or in the area down in Mani, you can find a monument um, to fascist or whatever, no, to communist aggression as well. And if you go into places, I'm sure like Icaria, you can find it for communist or a monument to those who fought collaborators in Nazism and fascism, and it just all depends where you go, really. So, anyways, let's back to what I was saying. If proper reconciliation was given, whatever that would look like, is it wrong to assume that maybe something perhaps like the junta wouldn't have occurred, the 7-year dictatorship? I mean, I know it's a very wide thing I'm throwing at you, but essentially, it's a continuation a bit of the conflict and the national
Oh,
schism,
yeah.
kind of,
Well,
could say.
it certainly is. I don't
Okay,
really think, yeah, I don't think many people would disagree with that
good. I
because
wasn't sure if I wasn't. So, okay.
oh no, I
To
mean,
my understanding, that's a big thing about it, yeah.
absolutely. I mean, and look, we have to admit too that who are the members of the junta, right? If not officers that were trained in that era. So, they are definitely a part of that story. So, yeah, I mean, to your point, right? Reconciliation, if it did change things in Greece, I guess that would be a matter of how much social change would have occurred. Because we're also then talking about, say, the role of the military in society and politics. Would that have changed sooner? since of course that has really only changed sort of officially in the early 90s, that the military couldn't be so sort of actively involved in politics. So, perhaps that could have changed 15, 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier. I mean, we don't know. So that is it's an interesting question to think about for sure.
So let's get back a bit to the Greek Civil War segment
Mhm.
because pretty much this episode's great, and I'm really happy I had you on
Mhm.
because we're going to start getting
Yeah.
more into it. The last 3, 4 episodes I've had on guest speakers, a lot of topics not related to the Civil War, and I've been just trying to buy myself time to get caught back up for the listeners. So this is great. Where is and does foreign intervention play a role in the Greek Civil War in terms of ideology, international interests, and how does it fit also into the, again, going back to the idea of Europe's 20th century conflict as one giant civil war? If you could speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of scholars of civil wars, when we're speaking generally about what makes a civil war, or people who study some of these conflicts, most people point out that a foreign intervention is one of the main features, or the lack thereof. Foreign intervention is really a main feature of a civil war conflict. And in many ways, we see foreign intervention really tipping the scales in a civil war conflict, or not, the absence of foreign intervention resulting in the outcome of this conflict. And the Greek Civil War is no exception. It's actually quite a big example
Right.
of the role of foreign intervention. We know, of course, through the Truman Doctrine, the decisive role played by U.S. Intervention in the conflict in the later phases of the war. We also then know the absence, or the dwindling role of foreign intervention from the Yugoslav
Right.
standpoint in the Democratic Army's fortunes.
Spoiler alert.
Uh,
Right. The Soviets do not come through as much as you'd think for the Greek communists, and this plays a huge
exactly.
role, you could say, and politically and in material and stuff like that and whatnot.
Right, that the lack of Soviet involvement in the conflict, and the withdrawal really of Yugoslav involvement plays a really major role, because that puts the Democratic Army in a position that is very similar to, say, in the American Civil War context, Robert E. Lee's army at the end of the Civil War. That there's really no hope for foreign intervention in the conflict by 1864. I mean, even earlier, a couple of years before, it became a huge part of the Union's war effort, was just trying to convince Britain and France not to interfere in this conflict, not to join and help the Confederacy out. And so by the end of the war, the army can't really do anything but just try to hold on. They don't have supplies. They don't have any hope for any kind of military intervention. And so there's not really much that they can do at that point, but just try to stick together and hope that there's some sort of peace negotiation that can get them to survive. The Democratic Army is in the same position in Greece in the late 40s. There's just, once there is no hope of any kind of Yugoslav involvement at the very least, and certainly not any Soviet
Hmm.
pressure to bear, that the war can't really end in any way that's going to benefit them. They're not going to win a military
Right.
conflict at that point, so they have to make other
While on
choices.
the flip side,
Uh,
the Greek army, the new Hellenic army, is being getting napalm, military advisors from the U.S., all types of support, state of the art for the time technologies or whatever in military and whatnot.
and to speak to your point about how does this then fit into the European Civil War story of the 20th century, right? We have maybe the most famous example being Spain. The
Mm.
Spanish Civil War is a conflict that is eventually pretty much all about foreign
Had a
intervention.
lot of foreign intervention from Greece, from everywhere. Who was the
I
American
mean,
author that fought in it? Not George Orwell. George Orwell? No, I forget.
well, George Orwell fought in the Spanish Civil
As
War.
well, huh? Maybe Ernest
Right.
Hemingway.
Yeah.
I'm
So
thinking about as well, very famously.
yes, I mean, a lot of famous people did something in Spain, basically either giving money or going there to fight. And so, of course, yeah, you have that sort of grassroots support for the Republic. in Spain. But then you have, of course, the much bigger weight of foreign intervention on the Francoist
Right.
side
From
with
Hitler,
Italy.
Mussolini, massive aid.
I mean, Italy basically is an unofficial belligerent in the conflict. I mean, they send a massive, massive military presence to fight. So Italy was basically at war with the Spanish Republic at that point. Germany, of course, also contributes to that to kind of show off their new military capabilities in the 30s. And of course, the lack of both Soviet and especially Soviet investment in that conflict dooms the Republic, and of course also the fact that the British and French are equally unwilling to actually support the Republic at that point. So foreign intervention is a huge, huge part of Civil War dynamics, both either the actual involvement of foreign actors in the conflict or the lack thereof can be decisive and often is. We see the same thing with the American Revolution, right? That
True.
what
French
what tips
involvement.
the scales?
Yeah, good
What
point.
tips the scales is the French alliance and also the fact that the Spanish and Dutch, while not being formal allies, are participating in that war against the British. This really does tip the scale in many conflicts. And also, I mean, at the very least, going back to the 20th century conflict idea, we know that there's a lot of foreign intervention in the Russian Civil War, for example. And so we have in these different conflicts, especially in Central and Eastern Europe at that time, of course, a lot of young Germans go fight in the Freikorps forces to fight against
Right.
communism
Plastiras had
in
sent,
those.
Greece sent troops in Crimea to fight as well, like we covered in this segment. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, so there's a ton of
Czech
foreign
Legion,
intervention,
famously.
ton of foreign intervention. I mean, American troops. I mean, there's all different kinds of foreign intervention in these different conflicts, and whether we're talking about specifically U.S. Involvement in these different conflicts, of course, it's mostly financial or like military um, training and sort of advisors. But you have these major states really sort of putting their thumb on the scale of these different conflicts, whatever we're talking about, from Spain to Greece to Russia.
You can even think
So
of
foreign,
today, even the Syrian civil war.
exactly,
I mean, where Russian help
exactly.
dried up and, support for rebels from various states, from Turkey and so on and so on, you know.
Exactly. I mean, it's a huge part of those decolonization conflicts, for instance, too.
Right.
Are foreign actors going to participate? How much are they going to get involved? What are they willing to invest in seeing the outcome that they want? So you're right. I mean, we know that this is going to only continue. It's a very common feature of a civil war that is kind of almost a paradox to us when we think about these conflicts because what did we start out saying? Civil wars are like these inherently local
That's a good point.
conflicts and like
Very
they're
paradoxical. Yeah.
very intimate conflicts, and yet we're talking about like, oh well, it all kind of comes down to big state actors who they're foreigners even, and yet they're going to come in and sort of dictate what happens, or perhaps change the course of that conflict.
And it's important too. I mean, I think I try not to fall into this, and there's many historians that critique other historians' takes when talking about foreign aid and whatnot, of not falling into the trap of, oh well, this side. In other words, the actors in the Greek Civil War are helpless puppets being steered by puppeteers in Britain and Moscow, and and so on and so on and so on. It's a delicate balance for sure by acknowledging foreign aid and the role it plays in foreign intervention, while also juggling the fact that Greek communists had their own divide. They weren't a monolith. As we're going to see, I've got to talk about that soon too. But between Tsiantos and people like Zachariadis, who was a Moscow, Haji KU2Vist, and you know very diehard and would follow the line of pretty much anything Moscow said. And then so on the other side, where you had people, that are Venizelos, they're liberals, they're Republicans, and varying degrees of that and whatnot. So yeah, it's a delicate balance. I mean, it's not easy. None of these things are for sure.
And another thing about the foreign intervention side of it that some people have brought up, and it's interesting, and it's hard to say whether or not there is really like this concrete connection between these things, but it certainly is at the very least a kind of interesting kind of story to trace that in a lot of these 20th century conflicts, for instance, that we see as civil wars, or even if we're looking at this as a European civil war through those decades, a lot of the actors are the same, right? A lot of the
Oh,
people
that's a
actually
great
participate.
point. Soviets.
Exactly. So on the state levels, yes, and even on individual levels, that some of these, some people are veterans of these different conflicts.
Grievous, for example.
Exactly.
I mean, you could say Greece and then goes to Cyprus with the Elka.
And so people have experience in these different people who fought in Spain and fought in Aoka, for instance,
Wow, get out of
uh,
here. No way.
uh, and
Wow.
or who, and of course, who might have also fought in the Greek Civil
Yes,
War as well,
absolutely.
in between.
Absolutely.
Quite likely that they did. And there are stories. I mean, I was reading one story about an Italian officer that got captured by Yugoslav partisans in World War II, and he was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. He fought in the Italian army that was fighting the Spanish Republic, and the leftists in Spain, basically. And so he viewed all of this basically in those terms of this is like one giant conflict, perhaps between right and
Right.
left.
For him, he was
And
looking
he's
at it
this,
ideologically for sure. Because how could you
and
not in his experience?
and and we know in this case when why it's an interesting story is that I mean he basically knew he was going to be executed. He fall into the hands of the partisans. You know what's going to happen,
Yeah.
and so he actually made a point to tell those partisans that he wanted to be shot by someone that fought in Spain
Wow.
against him
What a story. Oh my
to
gosh. How
see
dramatic.
and so supposedly it didn't happen, but it was just the idea that he was actually thinking in those terms. That this and so I imagine he's far from the only actual case of that. That there must have been people that had experienced those things, and in a way, I mean, what another historian had pointed out was there is a parallel too to the kind of revolutionary upheavals of Europe in the 1800s that a lot of people who say had fought for a constitution in Spain in the 1820s, they ended up fighting in Greece.
Wow.
And so, or in Italy, in different Italian provinces in the Risorgimento,
Right.
early kind of efforts to unify Italy at that point. So there's also that kind of crossover. And so perhaps even we can look at a parallel between those European civil wars or Europe as a civil war basically in the 20th century with perhaps even the 19th
19th
century with a
century.
different kind of set of ideology. Um,
Liberalism, kind of French revolutionary tradition of having
right,
a constitution and that kind of thing and whatnot.
right. Versus like this
Right.
conservatism, the
Metternich and
more
whatever. And
right, right. So perhaps even that
wow.
is part of the story. And one thing about that though that stuck out to me that they mentioned, and it's relevant here if we're talking about Greece, is the fact that when you think about that, I mean, just those places that I mentioned, right? Those three places all have civil wars in the 20th century.
Hmm.
Northern Italy, if we're going to just say Northern Italy, especially in the 40s, the Spanish Civil War, the Greek Civil War, all those places were places in the 19th century, that kind of immediate post French Revolution, Napoleonic era. They have all kinds of upheavals, and we're just talking about those maybe those soldiers fighting and going between those different places,
Hmm.
perhaps. So it's interesting that the southern Mediterranean region, kind of broadly, is a huge part of that story, whether we're talking about the 1800s or the 1900s. And one of the things that we might also say is a sort of interesting parallel there is the landscape when you think about it. Maybe not to the quite the same extent in northern Italy,
Right.
parts
But
of it.
certainly Spain.
When you think about Spain and Greece, mountainous regions, right? A lot of mountainous regions in both countries that had a tradition of people fighting in the mountains,
Right. Which are
right?
very conducive
And
to
kind
guerrilla
of
war and protracted conflicts and that kind of thing.
was exactly. And so what I mean, and of course scholars have brought up the kind of parallel, especially in talking about Greece, right? That yeah, there's a long-standing tradition in Greece
Right.
and in many other parts of the Balkans of these fighters in the mountains, and that
Right. The
the kind of
romanticize,
conflict,
yeah, the Andarti, the
right,
Klefti, the so on and so on, the
right,
rebel, and
and, and that there is certainly a parallel there, right? That and that we know where that kind of tradition comes from, and therefore too, we also know the kind of war that is going to be fought in a place like Greece. So
right.
in many ways, the Civil War, though we do talk so much about ideology driving the Greek Civil War, and we understand the kind of different sides of that. We also have to kind of take into consideration things like the landscape and the sort of cultural traditions and
Easy to
just
take
the
for
so
granted and overlook. I feel like certainly.
right, right. And then I think in a lot of our popular understandings, we do kind of miss that point that this actually does have a pretty strong connection to
Yeah.
the way in which conflicts were usually fought in places like that. They are generally intimate conflicts, and I mean, Greece just is not going to be the kind of place where it's going to lend itself to a more conventional conflict in the first place. I mean, no real part of of these conflicts were that
That's so
conventional,
baked into Greek culture and history. I feel like it's always the
right?
mountains. Go to the mountains.
And
It's retreat into the mountains is always a
and
thing,
it's
right?
easy to
It's
do it. I mean, there are so few battles at any point in modern history in Greece that one who studies military history would look at as like, okay, that's a
right.
conventional
There are no
battle.
battles taking
I mean,
place in
with
the plains of Thessaly, the flatlands of
right,
Macedonia. No, that
right.
wasn't happening.
This isn't like this isn't the days of like the Roman Civil
Right.
War, for instance, anymore. That's just not the way the wars are going to be fought in Greece in modern history. So, and of course, like just to go back to the Greek Revolution really quick, right? There is a battle that's fought that way, and it's a disaster for the Greek side, and so they realize like we can't fight that way. It's just not going to play. We could have the Europeans because it was a battle that a lot of Philhellenes died in, and it was a disaster. And so they realized very quickly, okay, this is not the way that we can conduct the war.
Right.
And the same thing would be true if we fast forward to the next century, right? There is an understanding. Why does the Greek resistance take the form that it does? It also just kind of lends itself to the landscape and to the ways in which people were trained to fight and
Right.
using the equipment that they had. And so all of that
It
makes
all
a
matched.
lot more
Yeah,
sense.
with each
Yeah, it
other.
makes a lot more sense. And it's different than the partisan warfare in Italy, for instance. I mean, that is a
Could you speak on that? I'm not familiar with partisan. I know Italy had a similar-ish conflict, but to my understanding, they reconciled much better than Greece did after World War II. So I've heard kind
kind
of.
of,
I don't know if that's
yeah,
fair.
kind of. I mean, it's still complicated, but
Yeah.
it's less. There's a lot less vehemence, at least officially, in those kind of post-war years
Hmm.
on the surface of it, but it lingers in many ways. I mean, a lot of the sort of upheavals in Italy in the 70s and 80s and the rise, the spike in terrorism and social strife in Italy was directly a result of the legacy of the Second World War and
Wow. Wow. Wow.
not
Wow.
really reconciling between the different sides there. But in terms of the partisan warfare, right? I mean, yes, they took to the hills and to the mountains, and there certainly was a kind of similar. There were similar features, to be sure, to say Greece or to Yugoslavia. The partisans would have looked quite similar, but in Italy too, there was more open type conflict as well than you would have seen fighting on the streets of cities, like fighting on the streets of Rome for instance, partisans taking part in kind of like quick attacks like that on German forces there. So it wasn't quite the same as like you just wouldn't have seen these sorts of things take place so much in these more mountainous regions, especially in the Balkans. It's for the most part a pretty different kind of resistance movement, or certainly say to like the resistance as it was conducted in Western Europe,
Right. Right. Right.
for
Right.
instance. So that would be more in common with say what you saw in Eastern Europe, where there were actually like pretty solid armies almost of resistance groups
Hmm.
fighting too. So So it's different, and that kind of all goes back to it's very hard to generalize about a lot of these points because we have to dive into these different examples and see, well, there are certainly parallels like we're talking about, but there's also a lot of unique circumstances that help us kind of better understand those individual events.
Right.
So it's always going to be a little tricky to sort of speak generally about these conflicts. But I'm not saying, and to kind of wrap up that
Right.
point, I'm not saying that the European Civil War concept is not helpful. I actually think it
Right.
is in a lot of ways, but it's also just like we can't just accept it wholesale.